The sound, for those who survived to recall it, was the first betrayal. Not the roar of engines or the crack of rifle fire, but the gentle, rhythmic scrape of stone on stone. It was the sound of a calm sea pushing 1,000,000 years of shingle up a steep pebble beach, a sound of profound and deceptive peace. In the pre-dawn gray of August 19th, 1942, the English Channel was a mirror of mercury and mist. From that mist emerged the dark, low shapes of landing craft, their engines throttled back to a conspiratorial murmur. Inside, packed shoulder to shoulder, were thousands of young men, Canadians mostly, Britons, a handful of Americans. They were the tip of a spear, forged over 2 years of frustration and waiting. This was the day they would strike back, the day they would test the ramparts of Fortress Europe. The plan was a marvel of complexity, a clockwork of timetables and objectives. Flanking attacks to silence the headland guns, an armored punch through the center, commandos striking at key installations. It was to be a raid, not an invasion, a reconnaissance in force, a single sharp blow to gather intelligence, to prove a point, and to be away before the enemy could fully react. The planners in London spoke of it as a rehearsal. For the men in the boats, sick with anticipation and the Channel's swell, it felt like the main performance. As the steel ramps slammed down, the illusion of peace was not broken, it was vaporized. The gentle scrape of shingle was consumed by the sound no first-hand account can truly capture, the concentrated mechanical fury of an entire division's worth of machine guns, mortars, and artillery, all zeroed in on a few hundred yards of killing ground. The clockwork plan disintegrated in the first 60 seconds. The rehearsal became a vivisection. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter, a 6-hour testament to the vast bloody chasm between theory and reality. By midday, the tide, now stained crimson, was pulling back, leaving behind a macabre collection of broken men and burning machines. The survivors were herded into captivity, the dead left to the gulls. The spear was shattered. The great raid was an undeniable, unmitigated catastrophe. And in the silent cabinet rooms of Whitehall, a terrible question began to form. How could a plan so meticulously crafted, involving the best of their men, result in a failure so absolute? The answer to that question would be 2 years in the making, and it would change the course of the war. The anatomy of failure, the blueprint for victory. The story of the Second World War is often told as a grand narrative of inevitable Allied triumph, a chronicle of heroic advances and righteous victories. But history is rarely so clean. Its currents are driven as much by failure as by success. To understand the triumph of 1944, one must first confront the tragedy of 1942. To comprehend the success of the Normandy landings, one must first dissect the calamity that unfolded on the beaches of a fishing port called Dieppe. By the summer of 1942, the strategic situation was desperate. In the east, the Soviet Union was bleeding, facing the full might of the Wehrmacht in a titanic struggle for survival. Joseph Stalin's demands for a second front in Western Europe grew more insistent, more accusatory with each passing week. In North Africa, the Desert War swayed back and forth, a draining campaign with no decisive end in sight. Both sides were exhausted, but desperately awaiting reinforcements.
In the Atlantic, the U-boat menace threatened Britain's lifeline to the United States. For 2 years of defensive warfare, of evacuations and bombing raids, had bred a deep-seated frustration. The arrival of American troops in the British Isles only amplified the pressure to act, to take the war to the enemy. The political and psychological need for an offensive gesture was immense. From this crucible of strategic necessity and political pressure, an organization known as Combined Operations emerged as the primary instrument of action. Led by the dynamic, ambitious, and controversial Lord Louis Mountbatten, its purpose was to master the complex art of amphibious warfare. Combined Operations was a laboratory for invasion, tasked with developing the techniques, the technology, and the doctrine required to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The concept of a large-scale raid on the French coast served multiple purposes. It would placate the Soviets, test German defensive theories, capture intelligence, and provide invaluable real-world experience. After considering several targets, the planners settled on Dieppe. On paper, it seemed a logical choice. It was within range of RAF fighter cover from southern England. The town itself was a small port, theoretically capable of being seized and held for a brief period. Its beaches, flanked by two imposing headlands, seemed to offer a classic opportunity for a pincer movement. The plan, codenamed Operation Jubilee, was born. It called for a force of some 6,000 men, the majority drawn from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. They would land across a 10-mile front. The main assault would be a frontal attack on Dieppe's long, straight beach, supported by the first deployment of the new Churchill tanks. Simultaneously, landings to the east and west on beaches codenamed Blue, Green, Yellow, and Orange would neutralize the heavy gun batteries on the cliffs that dominated the central landing zone. Commandos under the legendary Lord Lovett had their own specific targets, including a coastal battery and a radar station. A formidable air umbrella of over 70 squadrons would contest the skies, and a naval force of over 200 vessels would provide support. The intelligence reports, however, contained the seeds of disaster. The defensive strength of the 302nd Infantry Division was dangerously underestimated. The topography of the beaches was fatally misunderstood. The main beach at Dieppe was not sand, but a deep, loose bank of chert, a type of flinty gravel. To wheeled vehicles and, crucially, to the tracks of a 40-ton tank, it was less a ramp and more a trap. This single geological fact, overlooked or dismissed in the planning stages, would have catastrophic consequences.
They would be waiting, their machine guns already sighted on the water's edge. The meticulously constructed timetable for Operation Jubilee began to unravel before the first boot touched the shore. The easternmost flotilla, carrying the Royal Regiment of Canada towards Blue Beach, stumbled into a small German coastal convoy in the dark. A brief, vicious firefight erupted. The element of surprise, the cornerstone of the entire flanking strategy, was lost. While Lord Lovat's No. 4 Commando to the west achieved its objective with textbook precision, silencing the battery at Varengeville, the eastern flank was already collapsing. The alerted German defenders at Blue Beach met the Canadians with a storm of fire, pinning them down at the base of an impassable gully. Only a handful would make it back to England. The main assault began at 5:20 a.m. As the landing craft of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish Regiment ground onto the shingle of Dieppe's main beach, the German defenders opened fire. The archival footage is unforgiving. It shows a scene of pure chaos. Men leap from the ramps and are cut down in seconds, their bodies crumpling into the surf. The smoke of the naval bombardment offers little cover. The seawall, their first objective, is a distant, unattainable line, swept by interlocking fields of machine gun fire from the hotels and the castle on the western cliff. Then came the tanks of the 14th Canadian Armored Regiment. One by one, the Churchill tanks rolled down the landing craft ramps and onto the treacherous shingle. Their heavy tracks, designed for the mud of Europe, could find no purchase in the deep rolling stones. They spun, they dug in, they shed their tracks. Some were immobilized at the water's edge, becoming little more than static pillboxes. Others, which managed to crawl across the beach, were stopped cold by massive concrete anti-tank obstacles the engineers, under constant, murderous fire, had no hope of clearing. Of the 29 tanks that attempted to land, none would return. Their burning hulks became both funeral pyres for their crews and a grim symbol of the raid's fundamental failure. Aboard the command ship HMS Kalp offshore, information was a trickle of confused and contradictory radio messages. Some initial optimistic reports suggested that troops were in the town. This sliver of false hope prompted one of the most tragic decisions of the day: the dispatch of the floating reserve, the French-Canadian Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal. They were sent into the very same meat grinder that had consumed the first wave. Their landing was a repetition of the earlier horror, a fresh wave of young men sacrificed to a battle that was already irrevocably lost. As one officer on the beach radioed back with grim understatement, "There is a terrific battle going on here, but we are not in it." Veteran testimony from the survivors speaks not of a coherent engagement, but of a desperate, atomized struggle for individual survival. It was a soldier's nightmare. An exposed, featureless beach with no cover, facing an entrenched, invisible enemy who held all the advantages. The psychological toll was immense. A first-hand account from a private in the Essex Scottish recalls the sheer impossibility of the task. You couldn't see who was shooting at you, you could just see the dirt fly up around you.
You just laid there and prayed. By 11 a.m., the commanders offshore had seen enough. The order to evacuate was given. But withdrawal under fire is one of the most difficult of all military operations. The rescue was as costly as the landing. Landing craft attempting to nose onto the beach were targeted by every gun the Germans could bring to bear. Many were destroyed before they could take on a single man. The Royal Navy crews displayed immense bravery, but they could not defy the mathematics of concentrated firepower. At 1 p.m., the last boats pulled away, leaving behind the dead, the dying, and over 2,000 men who had no choice but to surrender. The raid was over. 6,000 men, 10,000 lessons. The final tally was sickening. Of the nearly 5,000 Canadians who took part, over 3,300 were killed, wounded, or captured, a casualty rate approaching 70%. The Royal Navy lost a destroyer and 33 landing craft. The Royal Air Force lost 106 aircraft in the desperate fight for control of the skies above Dieppe, a higher loss rate than during the most intense phases of the Battle of Britain. By any measure, Operation Jubilee was a disaster of the first order. In the immediate aftermath, a storm of recrimination and blame erupted. Was it an intelligence failure? A planning fiasco? Was Mountbatten's ambition to blame? Or had the Canadians simply not been up to the task? The Germans, for their part, used the raid as a massive propaganda victory, parading captured Canadian prisoners and displaying the wreckage of the Churchill tanks as proof of the weakness of the Allied war machine. For decades, the official narrative held that Dieppe, for all its horror, was a vital reconnaissance in force, a necessary blood sacrifice on the altar of knowledge. But many veterans and historians viewed this as a callous and inadequate justification for a poorly conceived slaughter. The debate raged for years.
Then, as once secret files became declassified, a more complex picture began to emerge, one that lent a darker, more clandestine purpose to the raid. Declassified documents have revealed a shadowy secondary objective, a commando pinch mission running parallel to the main assault. Attached to the South Saskatchewan Regiment was a team of intelligence specialists, whose goal, it is now believed, was to get into the German naval headquarters in Dieppe and seize codebooks and components from a 4-rotor Enigma machine. In 1942, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were struggling with the new, more complex naval Enigma, and the U-boat war was at its height. Capturing this material was of the highest strategic importance. This intelligence dimension does not excuse the tactical failures of the raid, but it does help to explain the high level of risk the Allied command was willing to accept. The prize, had it been won, would have been immense. But like every other aspect of the operation, this mission, too, ended in failure. The true, undeniable value of Dieppe was discovered not in its immediate aftermath. It was realized slowly, painfully, in the planning rooms and on the training grounds over the next 2 years. The raid became a foundational text for the planners of Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings. It was a detailed, blood-written manuscript on how not to conduct an amphibious assault.
Every mistake made at Dieppe was a critical lesson learned for Normandy. The first and most crucial lesson was the absolute necessity of overwhelming preliminary firepower. The light 10-minute shelling by destroyers at Dieppe was replaced at Normandy by a bombardment of unprecedented scale. Thousands of heavy bombers would carpet the defenses for hours, followed by the concentrated fire of battleships and cruisers whose heavy-caliber guns could pulverize concrete bunkers in a way destroyers never could. The goal was not to neutralize the enemy, but to annihilate him before the first infantrymen set foot on the beach. The second lesson concerned armored support. The image of the Churchill tanks foundering on the Dieppe shingle was burned into the minds of the Overlord planners. It gave birth to one of the war's great innovations, the specialized armor of the 79th Armored Division, better known as Hobart's Funnies. These were ingenious modifications of standard tanks, each designed to solve a specific problem encountered at Dieppe. There were the Crab, flail tanks to clear minefields, the Crocodile, flamethrower tanks to destroy pillboxes, and the Armored Vehicles Royal Engineers that could lay down portable bridges or demolish obstacles with a giant spigot mortar. These machines would provide the exact kind of specialized support that was so tragically absent in 1942. The third and perhaps most significant lesson was strategic. Dieppe proved the suicidal folly of a direct frontal assault on a heavily defended port city. The Overlord planners concluded that any major port on the French coast would be a fortress, a death trap. The solution was radical. Bypass the ports entirely. Land on open, sandy beaches like Sword, Juneau, Gold, Omaha, and Utah. But this created a massive logistical problem. How to supply a 1,000,000-man army without a deep-water harbor? The answer was another of the war's great engineering marvels, the Mulberry Harbors. 2 entire artificial ports, built in secret in Britain, towed across the channel in sections and assembled off the coast of Normandy. It was an audacious concept, born directly from the failure to take the port of Dieppe. The lessons extended to command and control, to casualty evacuation, to air support doctrine, and to the gathering of tactical intelligence. The ghosts of Dieppe haunted every planning meeting for D-Day. When an officer proposed a course of action, he would often be met with the sobering question, how would that have worked at Dieppe? The necessary disaster. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy,
The lessons of Dieppe were put into practice. On Juno Beach, the landing site for the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the men advancing up the sand were supported by Hobart's funnies clearing paths through minefields. Offshore, the guns of cruisers and battleships pounded the German defenses into dust. Above them, Allied air power was total and absolute. The men landing that day were the beneficiaries of the sacrifice made by their countrymen 2 years earlier. It is no exaggeration to say that the successful landings in Normandy were built upon the wreckage of Operation Jubilee. The knowledge gained came at a staggering human cost, a price paid almost entirely by a single Canadian division.
For the men who died on the shingle, or who spent the next 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, the concept of a necessary disaster would offer no comfort. Theirs was a private and absolute tragedy. But in the cold, brutal calculus of total war, Dieppe occupies a unique and paradoxical position. It was, simultaneously, one of the Allies' most humiliating tactical defeats and one of its most important strategic lessons. It was a failure so complete, so graphic, that it forced a fundamental re-evaluation of the entire doctrine of amphibious assault. It stripped away the last vestiges of pre-war optimism and replaced them with a sober, realistic understanding of what it would take to breach the Atlantic Wall. The defeat at Dieppe did not make victory in the Second World War possible on its own, but it made the specific victory of D-Day possible. For every man who fell on the cruel shingle of Dieppe, it is said that 10 more were saved on the sands of Normandy. It was a butcher's bill paid in advance, a disaster that through the grim alchemy of war was transformed into a blueprint for ultimate triumph. The names of the dead from that August day in 1942 are not just a memorial to loss, they are an indelible part of the foundation of the final victory.